The sharp smell of ozone and burnt wire mingled with expensive perfumes and panic. John hated art exhibitions. Too pretentious, too little sense. But murder always made sense. Especially when it happened in the luxurious Mission Hill Gallery, in front of dozens of witnesses. He pushed his way through the panicked crowd, his white and blue raglan sweatshirt with bears standing out against the evening gowns and tuxedos. Over it was his usual, slightly worn trench coat. His face, illuminated by flashing emergency lights, was calm and focused, as always. The centerpiece, Evelyn Grace's Symphony of Light, was still standing. It was a giant structure made of polished metal and thousands of microprojectors that created illusions of movement, color, and shape in the air. Now it looked like a mangled monument, with charred wires sticking out of it, and one of the projectors had exploded, leaving a black stain on the ceiling. However, the main focus was not on the explosion. Evelyn Grace, a 30-year-old icon of contemporary art, lay on a podium surrounded by transparent panels. Her body was as graceful as one of her own installations. The explosion did not kill her. The medical examiner, Detective Elizabeth Rose, who was already on the scene, pointed to a barely visible puncture mark on her neck. "Liquid toxin," Rose stated dryly, her voice barely cutting through the noise of panic. "Administered seconds before death. Exact time, 8:15 p.m. She died just as the projector exploded and the light installation descended into chaos." John looked around the podium. The transparent panels were human height, flawless, with no visible holes or damage. If Evelyn had been behind them, no one could have touched her. "Miss Rose," John asked, leaning over the body, "how many seconds does it take to administer the toxin?" "What? 2 at most. It's almost instantaneous." John stood up. "So, we have another locked room," he muttered, his gaze sliding over the fading symphony of light. But this time, it wasn't a door that protected it, but illusions. John walked around the podium. The transparent panels surrounding the podium were not just glass, but high-strength acrylic, used in art installations to protect against vandals. They stretched from floor to ceiling, leaving no gaps through which a syringe could be inserted. John ran his hand over the smooth surface. "No fingerprints except her own," Rose reported. "No holes, no cracks, nothing. The killer couldn't have physically touched her." "What about the air?" John asked, his gaze fixed on the ventilation system, which was humming softly. "The toxin is liquid, administered by injection. Not gas," Rose explained. "It could have been sprayed, but there would be traces on the panels." "There aren't any." John turned his gaze to the remains of the Symphony of Light. The explosion of the projector was clearly planned. It was the perfect moment of distraction and chaos. The security guard responsible for safety was now trembling in the corner. "Detective, I saw everything. I was standing by the emergency exit. The panels were locked with a magnetic lock. They only opened after the fire alarm went off from the explosion. Until then, she was there alone." John leaned toward the podium, where a complex lighting and projection system was located. This installation, it used lasers and light to create three-dimensional illusions, right? "Yes," replied the gallery owner, Mr. Chesterton, a tall, tense man in an expensive tuxedo, who had finally approached. "It made objects disappear, appear, move. It was brilliant." "Brilliant," John repeated, picking up a small, barely noticeable piece of metal sticking out of the floor of the podium, right next to where Evelyn was lying. The metal looked like part of a needle or thin wire. It was hidden under a beam of light. If you wanted to introduce something that disappears quickly, you would use the installation itself to hide the weapon and then disguise its removal. John stood up and looked at Chesterton. Mr. Chesterton, who had full access to the assembly and engineering diagrams of this symphony? Who knew how this thing really worked, not how it looked? Was it an artist who knew how light could hide a shadow, or an engineer who knew how a shadow could hide an injection? John met Gabriel Wong in his studio, located in a gloomy but fashionable neighborhood of Brooklyn. The studio was filled with unfinished, heavy sculptures that looked like disappointed muscles. Gabriel, himself a gloomy, elegant man with a gray beard, smoked a thin cigarette. She was your student, John stated, sitting down on an old chair, his trench coat unbuttoned. And my downfall, Gabriel replied sharply, exhaling smoke. I taught her how to see light. And she used my method to steal my light. My sales dropped 80% after her first exhibition. John placed a photograph of Evelyn on the cluttered table. You were at the premiere. Where were you at 8:15 p.m.? I was standing in the back row, near the entrance. Wong paused. I was waiting for her to stumble. Her symphony was a blatant plagiarism of my shadow play concept. I hated her success, detective. I wanted her to fail. I can confirm that for you. Did you know the technical details of her installation? No. I just saw that it was a brilliant fake. But I know how art works. Light can deceive the eyes, but shadows always tell the truth. John looked back at Gabriel's sculptures. They were heavy, material, devoid of lightness. His art was about weight and reality. Evelyn created illusions and ephemerality. As a sculptor, you don't use liquid toxins, Mr. Wong. You use weight, John suggested. But someone used the art of illusion to hide a material, physical murder. You hated her, but do you have the intellect to create such a mechanism? Gabriel just smiled, his eyes cold. I'm an artist, detective. I can create a mechanism that is as elegant as it is deadly. But I would never use a liquid toxin. I would use solid matter. As she deserved. John understood. There was a motive, but there was no method characteristic of this suspect. His answer about solid matter was the key. John left the workshop, feeling that Gabriel was telling the truth, even though he had confessed to hatred. John met with Sophia Ramirez, Evelyn Grace's former assistant, in her small, rented apartment, which was as minimalist as her late mentor's art. Sophia looked exhausted but not broken. Her devotion to Evelyn seemed almost religious. I love Evelyn. She was my life, Sophia said quietly, her eyes red from crying. She was a genius. Did you know all her secrets? John asked, noticing how her gaze lingered briefly on the bare sweatshirt. Yes. I knew her schedule, her habits, her fears. I knew her better than she knew herself. John placed the toxin report on the table. It's a rare toxin, Sophia. Very rare, hard to find. I don't know anything about that. I was involved in art, not chemistry. You had access to Symphony of Light during installation, John insisted. To all the internal mechanisms. You could have integrated the toxin delivery mechanism into the installation's design. You knew the exact time the projector would explode to create the perfect distraction. Sophia clenched her hands. I would never have hurt her. I protected her. From what? John leaned closer, his voice softening. From fame? Or from her true talent? She was unbeatable. But you wanted to be an artist yourself, didn't you? You went to the same school as her. Did she steal your ideas? Use your sketches? Sophia cried harder, but her tears looked like anger, not grief. She was better than me. I admit that. But she didn't appreciate what she had. She was carefree, throwing around ideas that were my whole life. John felt he had touched a nerve. What is your biggest secret, Sophia? I edited her diary. She wrote drafts and I turned them into masterpieces. I was her voice. But she never acknowledged my contribution. John stood up. Sophia had a motive related to envy of genius and hidden access. She couldn't kill Evelyn directly, but she could help the installation kill her. Her lie about the diary was the first crack in her perfect facade. Where is that diary now, Sophia? John asked. I burned it. After her death. It was my farewell to her. John felt that this was not the end. The diary was the key to the real motive. John met Mr. Chesterton, the gallery owner, again in his elegant but now empty office. Chesterton looked even more tense. He exuded not only expensive perfume but also panic. Mr. Chesterton, John began, his gaze sliding over the expensive but apparently already mortgaged paintings on the walls. Your gallery has had financial difficulties in recent years, hasn't it? Chesterton nervously smoothed his tie. Evelyn Grace was my hope. Her Symphony of Light was supposed to be my salvation. But it became your trap, John remarked. We know you had huge debts. Not just to the bank. To some very impatient investors. Chesterton's face turned pale. What are you talking about? I'm a businessman, not a criminal. You were in the security room when Evelyn died, John continued, his voice calm but clear. A perfect alibi. But we know you had complete control over the gallery's security system. All the electronic locks, all the cameras. John leaned forward, pointing to a photograph of the podium where Evelyn had died. When the projector exploded, the fire alarm went off. It automatically opened the podium panels, didn't it? But someone could have turned it off for a few seconds before the explosion. Enough time for the syringe to be injected. And then turned back on again. Chesterton smiled. It was a nervous, tense grimace. That's absurd. All the systems are connected to the central computer. I couldn't, or could, John interrupted. You're the only one who knew all the access codes and security algorithms. And you're the only one who needed not just Evelyn's death, but chaos to cover up your own financial machinations. Her death looked like an accident. It's the perfect cover for someone who wants to avoid retribution. Wayland had ties to the mafia. His debts were much greater than mine, Chesterton suddenly blurted out. And he was a partner of my biggest creditor. He wanted to take over the gallery. John felt he had touched on another side of the mystery. Chesterton had a motive, but his plan was not about genius, it was about survival. He had access to the system, but could he have done it? And where were you at 8:15 p.m., Mr. Chesterton, when the explosion went off and Evelyn died? John asked. Chesterton faltered, his face turning pale again. I was in the security room with the others. But I looked away for a second. To check my cell phone. It was only a second. John nodded. Everyone had a second to become a murderer. John returned to the gallery. Most people had left, leaving only security guards and forensic experts carefully dismantling the remains of the Symphony of Light. John stood again at the podium surrounded by transparent acrylic panels. Light can deceive the eyes, but shadows always tell the truth, he recalled Gabriel Wong's words. He asked the technicians to restore the lighting scheme to see the last moment of the installation. The technicians recreated the scene. At 20 hours and 10 seconds, the light on the podium became completely white, then began to change rapidly, preparing for the climax, and at 20 hours and 15 seconds, the projector exploded. Stop at 20 hours and 14 seconds, John ordered. At that moment, the light was so intense that it seemed as if Evelyn Grace's body disappeared for a second. John noticed that the rays that created the illusion were directed not only at her, but also at the acrylic barrier itself. He remembered the tiny piece of metal he had found on the podium. The panels, John whispered. They were closed, but they weren't impenetrable. He called the technicians and showed them how, at a certain moment when the white light was at its peak, it created such an intense illusion that it made the transparent panels so bright that they appeared to be a solid wall of light. But this same illusion could be used to hide something else. Lasers, John said, his ice blue eyes lighting up with understanding. Did Evelyn use laser projectors? The technician nodded. Yes, but they were only meant to create an illusion. They couldn't cause any harm. What if the laser wasn't used to cause harm, but to create an opening? John asked. At the moment of peak brightness, when no one could look directly at it and the panel seemed impenetrable, someone redirected a powerful laser. Not at Evelyn, but at the panel. John approached one of the panels. He looked closely and saw it. Not a crack. A tiny, almost invisible microscopic hole, disguised as an optical reflection from the light. A hole small enough to insert a long, thin needle with liquid toxin. The killer had used Evelyn's own art, her Symphony of Light, to create the perfect, temporary gap in the locked room. The weapon, the needle, was hidden in the installation itself, ready for activation. We found not who did it, but how. John unbuttoned his trench coat, feeling that the puzzle had been solved. Now we need to find who had access to redirect the laser and the toxin. John sat with two experts, Dr. Marshall, a toxicologist, pale and tired, and Liam, a young, nervous optical engineer who had worked on the installation. We examined the remains. That hole in the panel was burned by a highly concentrated laser beam, Liam explained. It wasn't a standard projector laser. It was a focused CO2 laser integrated into the system. It could be redirected, but only with a master key and knowledge of a special reprogramming code. John listened intently. Who knew the code and had the key? Only Evelyn and her assistant, Sophia Ramirez, Liam muttered. But Sophia couldn't have known how to reprogram it. It's pure optics and engineering. Dr. Marshall interrupted, handing John the report. Now about the toxin. We've identified it. It's not just poison. It's synthetic neurotoxin VX52, which leaves no trace. It's only used in highly secure biological laboratories. It's almost impossible to obtain. Which of the suspects had access to such a laboratory? John asked, adjusting his trench coat. None, Marshall replied. But Gabriel Wong, a rival artist, has a wife who is a leading researcher at a biotech startup working with similar substances. Or Sophia Ramirez. Her brother is serving time for stealing chemical reagents and had connections in the black biotech community. John felt the puzzle pieces falling into place. He looked at Liam. At the moment Evelyn died, the light was completely white and the panel appeared solid. If Sophia was the killer, she would have had the technical knowledge. If it was Gabriel, he would have had to know how to integrate the weapon. John thought about Sophia again. Her tears, her hidden anger, her lies about the diary. And now, her criminal brother and access to the toxin. Liam, is there any possibility that the laser could have been redirected remotely? Not from the remote control, but using an external signal. Yes, replied the engineer. Evelyn sometimes used her laptop for fine calibration from behind the scenes. The laptop was on the table near the podium. John stood up. I need that laptop. I think the killer didn't just use an illusion. He used a program that was perfectly synchronized with the moment of the explosion. And do you know who was closest to the synchronization? John, Engineer Liam, and Detective Rose returned to the gallery. John asked Liam to connect Evelyn's laptop to the installation and run the program that was supposed to start at 8 p.m. This program didn't just control the lights, Liam explained. It was designed to be perfectly synchronized with the projector's explosion. Evelyn was obsessed with precision. A true artist is obsessed not with precision, but with the moment, John remarked. On the laptop screen, John found a small hidden file called Final Touch. It was a script that was only supposed to be activated by an external signal. Activating this script redirects the CO2 laser, Liam said, his voice trembling with realization. The laser burns a microscopic hole in the panel, and at the same moment, a pneumatic micromechanism built into the floor of the podium is triggered. It pushes a long needle coated with liquid toxin through the hole. And it all happens in 1 second, just when the light becomes so white that the human eye sees only a solid wall, John concluded. A perfect illusion that hides physical murder. John noted the time when the final touch was supposed to go off, 8 hours and 13.5 seconds p.m. At 8 o'clock and 10 seconds p.m., the entire gallery saw Evelyn on the podium. At 8 o'clock and 15 seconds p.m., she was dead. Who had access to the external signal that activated the script at 8 hours and 13.5 seconds and had a solid alibi? John looked at Rose. Mr. Chesterton turned away for a second to check the connection. Gabriel Wong was standing at the end of the hall. Sophia Ramirez was next to the control panel. But John remembered how Sophia had behaved. Her nervous reaction, her denial of access to technology, her passionate defense of Evelyn's genius, and the burned diary. It's not about who knew the code, but who knew the time. Evelyn always carried a fitness tracker bracelet with her. She was obsessed with her health. John took the report. Evelyn's tracker showed a spike in stress, then a drop in heart rate at exactly 8 o'clock and 14 seconds p.m. Sophia knew her habits, her schedule, her biorhythms, John said slowly, his eyes sharp as lasers. The killer wasn't waiting for an external explosion. He was waiting for a signal from Evelyn's own body. Or, more precisely, from her bracelet. Sophia could have created a script on her laptop that would be activated not when a button was pressed, but when Evelyn's bracelet on the podium recorded a certain heart rate caused by excitement before the climax. This would ensure absolute synchronization. And only Sophia, who kept her diary and charts, could know when Evelyn's pulse would reach the critical point to activate the deadly mechanism. Evelyn wasn't the real artist, John whispered. It was Sophia. She created the deadly performance and then destroyed the diary to hide her true voice and motive, her own neglected genius. John gathered Sophia Ramirez, Gabriel Wong, and Mr. Chesters in the gallery office, which had now been completely cleared out. Evelyn's laptop lay on the table, with a hidden file labeled Final Touch glowing on the screen. You all had motives, John began, his sweatshirt and trench coat a familiar contrast to the formal setting. Gabriel, you hated her for stealing your light. Chesterton, you needed her to hide your debts. But only one of you knew how to turn an installation of light into an installation of death. He looked directly at Sophia Ramirez. Her face was tense, but she still remained calm. You lied, Sophia. You didn't just edit her diary. You were her true voice. She was the canvas, and you were the brush. Your ideas, your emotions, your genius, which she neglected, hiding behind her fame. And you burned that diary because it contained not her drafts, but yours. Sophie clenched her fists, her composure beginning to crumble. That's not proof, detective. The proof is her death, Sophie. You knew her biorhythms. You knew that at exactly 8 hours and 13.5 seconds p.m., her pulse would reach its peak. You created the Final Touch script on this laptop. It was set to receive a radio signal from Evelyn's fitness bracelet, not an external signal. John pressed the keyboard. When Evelyn's bracelet recorded her peak pulse, it triggered the mechanism. It activated a laser that burned a microhole in the panel, and a pneumatic mechanism with a needle loaded with toxin. You were next to the control panel when the explosion went off, and no one could see you. You used the illusion of light to hide how your own creation killed your abuser. Gabriel Wong and Chesterton looked at Sophia in disbelief. You knew no one would look for the hole because it was hidden by the peak brightness, and the toxin would quickly disappear. You created a crime as brilliant as any of your works, Sophia. Sophia's tears finally turned to anger. She burst out, her voice filled with painful pride. She stole my symphony. She stole my soul. It was my only way to prove to the world that I am a true genius. I created the perfect mechanism that used her own body, her own pride, her own art against her. It was my final installation. John waved his hand. Justice, like art, had found its completion. Sophia Ramirez, her pride destroyed but her genius acknowledged, now sat in the police station. She described in detail how she had created the deadly mechanism using a laser, a pneumatic needle, and, most importantly, synchronization with Evelyn's biometric data. Her confession was long, detailed, and full of technical pride. John left the interrogation room, taking off his trench coat. He felt relief at having solved this complicated puzzle, but also bitterness at the realization that art had become a tool for such cold-blooded revenge. Detective Rose approached him, handing him a cup of coffee. Great work, Captain. You saved the art world from yet another illusion. They don't need my saving, Rose, John replied, taking a sip. They will always create illusions. My job is to find the truth in the shadows. In this case, the shadow was the brightest light. He looked down at his white and blue hoodie with bears on it. Art can be complex, but human envy is always a simple, basic motive. Sophia admitted her guilt. She's even proud of how perfectly she used technology. But she'll never be able to create anything else. That's her punishment, Rose remarked dryly.